Army Ranger Marcus Thompson had survived 3 combat tours, 2 Purple Hearts, and an IED blast that killed his entire squad, but nothing in his military training had prepared him for the moment he sat alone in an empty apartment with nothing left to live for, until he found a letter his late grandmother had written him years earlier saying, "When everything falls apart, come home to the island. I have left you something that will save you," and what he discovered inside that small cottage off the coast of Maine would reveal that every single moment he thought God had abandoned him in the darkness, someone had been on her knees holding him before the throne of heaven. If you love your mom and dad, hit that subscribe button and show some love. This story will change how you see everything. Marcus Thompson grew up in a small town in rural Tennessee, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and Friday nights meant high school football and Saturday mornings meant church. He'd been raised by his parents with strong values and a faith that felt genuine and alive when he was young, attending the same small Baptist church his family had been part of for 3 generations. His grandmother, Eleanor Thompson, had been the spiritual anchor of the entire family, a woman of extraordinary faith and quiet strength who'd raised 4 children largely on her own after her husband died young, who'd worked double shifts at the textile mill to keep food on the table while somehow still finding time to pray every single morning before the sun came up. Marcus had idolized his grandmother growing up, spending summers at her cottage on a small island off the coast of Maine, a place she'd inherited from her own parents and that had been in the family for nearly a century. The island was tiny, barely 3 acres, accessible only by a small ferry that ran twice daily from the mainland town of Harborview, and Eleanor had maintained the cottage there with the same quiet determination she applied to everything in her life. Those summer visits had been some of the happiest of Marcus's childhood, fishing off the rocky shore with his grandmother, learning to read weather patterns from the clouds, sitting on the cottage porch in the evenings while Eleanor told stories about the family and about her faith and about the God she spoke to as naturally as she spoke to her grandchildren. Eleanor Thompson was not a woman who wore her faith like a badge or wielded it like a weapon. She lived it the way she breathed, quietly and continuously and without apparent effort. She didn't lecture about religion or push her beliefs on neighbors who thought differently. She simply prayed, deeply and consistently and specifically, and the results of those prayers were a matter of local legend in Harborview and in the small Tennessee town where she'd raised her children. People came to Eleanor when they were desperate, when doctors had given up hope and lawyers had exhausted options, when marriages were failing and children had gone missing, because Eleanor Thompson would pray with you and somehow things would change. She never claimed credit for any of it, attributing everything to God with the same matter-of-fact certainty that other people attributed weather patterns to meteorology. Marcus had joined the army at 18, partly for the education benefits and partly because he'd felt a calling toward service that he couldn't fully explain. His grandmother had driven him to the recruitment office herself, and before he went inside she'd held both his hands and prayed over him with a specificity and intensity that had both embarrassed and moved him. She'd prayed for his protection in language that was so detailed it almost sounded like she knew exactly what he was going to face in the years ahead, asking God to cover him in ambushes and in desert heat and in moments when he couldn't see any way forward. Marcus hadn't understood then how literally she'd meant those words, and wouldn't understand for many years to come. His military career had been defined by exceptional performance and significant trauma in roughly equal measure. He'd excelled in basic training and had been selected for Ranger School, a grueling course that broke most of the men who attempted it and graduated only those with the physical and mental capacity to function effectively under prolonged extreme stress. Marcus had graduated in the top 10% of his class and had been assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment at Fort Benning, where he'd thrown himself into the work of becoming the best soldier he could be with the focused intensity that had characterized everything he'd done since childhood. His first deployment to Afghanistan had been an education in the gap between training and reality, in how quickly situations could turn deadly and how even the best preparation couldn't fully account for the chaos and randomness of combat. He'd performed well under fire, earning commendations from his platoon commander and the respect of teammates who'd been in combat before, but he'd returned from that deployment carrying memories that didn't fit into normal conversations and that kept him awake in ways that he told himself were just part of the job. He'd call Eleanor from a base phone before flying home, and she'd listened to his silences more than his words and had told him she'd been praying extra hard for him these past months, that she'd felt something heavy around him that she'd been working through on her knees every morning. Marcus had laughed it off then, grateful for her love but not fully grasping what she was telling him. His second deployment had been worse. His platoon had been ambushed in a narrow valley in Cunha province during a patrol that should have been routine, and in the 45-minute firefight that followed, Marcus had watched 3 close friends die and had killed more men than he could clearly remember afterward. He'd received a Purple Heart for the shrapnel wound to his left arm that he'd kept fighting through, but the decoration felt meaningless compared to the weight of what he'd seen and done in those 45 minutes. The names of the 3 friends he'd lost were burned into his memory with a clarity that the faces of people he'd met since had never matched. He heard their voices sometimes, at night or in quiet moments, not in a disturbing way but in the way that the dead sometimes stay present with those who love them. He'd call Eleanor after returning from that deployment, not saying much, just needing to hear her voice. She'd talk to him about faith and about darkness and about how God was present in places that felt completely godless, and Marcus had listened without fully believing, too raw and too exhausted to access the faith he'd grown up with. But he'd felt something during that phone call that he couldn't articulate, something that had loosened the tightness in his chest slightly, something that felt like being recognized by someone who truly knew him. Years later he would understand that what he'd felt was the residual effect of his grandmother's prayers, the spiritual warmth that surrounded someone who had been faithfully interceded for over decades. His third deployment had produced the worst day of his life, and in a career that had already included considerable darkness, that was a significant distinction. His squad had been traveling in 2 vehicles on a road that had been swept for IEDs the previous day when the lead Humvee hit a device so large and so well concealed that no amount of standard detection would have found it. The explosion lifted the vehicle completely off the ground and transformed it in an instant from a military transport carrying 4 American soldiers into a burning mess of metal and tragedy. Marcus had been in the second vehicle, and the blast had thrown him clear with a concussion and various injuries while taking the lives of every man in the lead vehicle, 4 of his closest friends and most trusted teammates. He'd regained consciousness alone in a foreign landscape with smoke rising from the destroyed vehicle ahead of him and the certain knowledge that enemy fighters would be moving toward the explosion. What followed was a period of time that Marcus couldn't fully account for even now, a sequence of events driven entirely by training and survival instinct while the conscious, feeling part of him seemed to have stepped back from what was happening. He'd been extracted eventually, had spent time at a military hospital at Wagram before being transferred to Landstuhl in Germany, and had come home to a Purple Heart ceremony that he'd stood through feeling completely disconnected from his own body. The transition out of active duty had been handled with the usual institutional efficiency that addressed paperwork and benefits and physical injuries while having limited tools for the invisible wounds that were actually the most debilitating. Marcus had gone through the prescribed programs, had filled out the assessments honestly enough to register above normal on the PTSD screening tools but not honestly enough to trigger the level of intervention he actually needed. He'd told himself what veterans often told themselves, that he was managing, that it would get better with time, that other people had been through worse and had come out fine. These statements contain enough truth to be convincing and enough falsehood to be dangerous. For a while civilian life had seemed to be working. He'd found a job with a defense contractor that valued his military experience and paid him well enough that financial stress wasn't compounding everything else. He'd met Rachel at a friend's wedding, a kindergarten teacher from Murfreesboro with patient eyes and a steady presence who seemed genuinely unintimidated by his silences and careful about not pushing into spaces he'd closed off. They dated for 2 years and married in a small ceremony that his grandmother had attended despite her declining health, her face shining with the happiness of someone watching a prayer come true. Eleanor had pulled Marcus aside before the ceremony and held his face in both her hands and told him he was going to be okay, with the same certainty she'd always brought to her most important statements. Marcus and Rachel had bought a house in a Nashville suburb and had begun the work of building a life together with the ordinary combination of effort and hope that marriage required. But Marcus was carrying more than he'd disclosed, more than he'd fully admitted even to himself, and the weight of what he was carrying began to affect everything. He was present in body but increasingly absent in every way that mattered. He startled at sudden sounds and avoided crowded spaces. He couldn't watch certain films or hear certain songs without being transported back to places he desperately didn't want to revisit. He drank more than he should have, initially just at night to take the edge off and help him sleep, then increasingly throughout the day to maintain the numbness that had become his primary coping mechanism. Rachel had been patient for longer than Marcus deserved, which was something he would only fully appreciate later. She'd suggested therapy multiple times and had offered to go with him, had researched veteran resources and printed out information that he'd received with gratitude and never followed up on, had absorbed his bad nights and his distance with a grace that he'd mistaken for acceptance rather than recognizing as the grace of someone trying desperately to hold together a marriage that was coming apart from the inside. When he'd come home one night to find her bags packed and her eyes clear with a resolution that had clearly been a long time forming, he understood in that moment that he'd burned through the last of her patience while failing to notice it was running low. The divorce was civil and the division of their shared life was handled without unnecessary cruelty, which somehow made it worse rather than better, the absence of anger making the failure feel more complete and more permanent. The house was sold. Marcus found a one-bedroom apartment in Nashville that he furnished minimally and lived in like a man camping in his own life, taking up as little space as possible and making no investment in comfort or permanence. His drinking continued, no longer functional but not yet catastrophic, the daily maintenance of a numbness that was the only thing standing between him and everything he didn't want to feel. The job loss came next, a predictable consequence of a deterioration that had been visible to everyone around Marcus before it was visible to himself. He'd shown up to an important client meeting impaired enough that the client noticed and mentioned it to his manager, and the HR process that followed had been handled professionally and completely, leaving Marcus with a severance package and no further obligations to an organization that could no longer count on him. He'd driven home from that meeting and sat on the floor of his apartment, because it was the only furniture he had, and he'd stayed there for a long time. He thought about his grandmother and the certainty she'd always carried about God's goodness and about his life having meaning, and he couldn't find any of that certainty in himself, couldn't reach back to the faith he'd grown up with because it felt separated from him by too much distance and too much damage. The night in the Virginia hotel room had happened during a period he didn't like to think about, a business trip that had turned into 3 days of drinking after the job was done, in a city where nobody knew him and the anonymity felt both freeing and terrifying. He'd sat on the edge of a hotel bed in the early hours of the morning with a service pistol on the nightstand beside him and had thought with perfect clarity about whether continuing forward was worth the effort. He'd ultimately put the weapon away not because he'd found a compelling reason to keep going but because he'd thought about Eleanor and hadn't been able to do it knowing it would break her heart. He'd never told anyone about that night, had packed it away in the same sealed part of himself where he kept the worst of his combat memories, and had driven home the next day pretending it hadn't happened. It was perhaps 6 weeks after losing his job, in the depths of a Nashville January that matched his interior weather precisely, that Marcus found the letter. He'd been going through a box of his grandmother's things that his mother had sent him, items Eleanor had specifically designated for him in her estate, and among the photographs and small keepsakes was an envelope with his name written in Eleanor's handwriting, the large looping letters she'd always used, the handwriting that had addressed birthday cards and care packages throughout his life. He'd held it for a long time before opening it, understanding that whatever was inside represented a final communication from the person who'd known him best and loved him most consistently. The letter was warm and direct and full of the particular faith that had always been Eleanor's most defining characteristic. She wrote about watching him grow from a small boy who could spend entire afternoons investigating tidal pools on the island shore to the man he'd become, about the pride she felt in his service and the ache she felt knowing what that service had cost him. She wrote about prayer with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone describing something as real and practical as cooking or carpentry, telling him she'd been praying for him specifically every single day since the day he was born and would keep doing so for as long as she was living and perhaps beyond. And then she'd written the words that sent him out the door and into his truck within half an hour of reading them, driving north through the Tennessee night toward a destination that felt less like a choice than a summons. Marcus arrived in Harborview in the blue hour before dawn after 17 hours of driving punctuated only by gas stops and coffee that he needed more than he'd needed anything in years. He caught the first ferry of the morning, standing at the bow in the cold sea air while the small vessel made its way across the channel to the island, and felt something shift in him that he couldn't identify but that felt significant. The island looked exactly as he remembered it from childhood summers, the same rocky shore and scrubby pines and the small white cottage sitting slightly back from the water with its dark green shutters and the weather vane his great-grandfather had mounted on the roof that still spun in the January wind. He found the key under the blue stone by the front step, exactly where it had always been, and unlocked the door to his grandmother's world. The cottage smelled like Eleanor, like cedar and old books and lavender, and standing in the doorway breathing that familiar smell Marcus felt the first deep crack appear in the protective numbness he'd been maintaining for years. The smell carried him back to childhood summers with an immediacy that no deliberate memory ever had, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment just breathing it in before moving inside. Everything was as Eleanor had left it, her personal items in their places, her reading glasses on the side table beside the rocking chair, her Bible open on the kitchen table to a page she'd apparently been reading when she last sat there. The kitchen was stocked with canned goods and staples that suggested she'd prepared for someone to be there after her, knowing Marcus would come even if she couldn't know exactly when. On the kitchen table, propped against a small ceramic vase containing dried wildflowers from what must have been her last summer on the island, was a note written on folded paper in Eleanor's handwriting. It said simply the bookshelf in the bedroom. The brown journal. Marcus went to the small bedroom with its iron bed and patchwork quilt and the bookshelf crowded with paperbacks and hardcovers and multiple well-worn Bibles of different translations. The brown journal was leather-bound and visibly old, its spine cracked from years of use and its cover worn smooth from handling. He carried it to his grandmother's rocking chair and sat down, pulling the quilt from the nearby chest over his legs against the January cold, and opened to the first page. The first entry was dated 33 years earlier, the week of his birth, and it began Marcus James Thompson came into this world yesterday, and God spoke to my heart that this boy will walk through deep waters. I'm making a promise today to pray for him every single day for the rest of my life. Lord, let your hand be on him from his first breath to his last. Eleanor had kept that promise with a faithfulness that took Marcus's breath away as he turned the pages. Every day for 30 years she'd written out her prayers for him in this journal, specific and detailed and clearly informed by something beyond ordinary maternal intuition. She'd prayed for his protection during childhood illnesses, for his direction during adolescence, for his relationships and his choices and his spiritual life with the consistency of someone who considered this work as important as anything else she did. As he moved through the years and found the entries corresponding to his deployments, the effect became overwhelming. She'd written on the morning of his worst firefight in Kina province with an urgency that suggested she'd felt the danger before he'd experienced it, asking God specifically to protect him from an ambush and to steady his hands and clear his mind. The entry for the 3 days preceding the IED blast showed a woman in sustained, desperate intercession, writing that she felt a heaviness around Marcus that she'd been fighting through prayer for days, that she'd woken each morning with his name on her lips and a fear that she refused to give into but that drove her to her knees with unusual intensity. And the entry for the night in the Virginia hotel room, the night Marcus had never told anyone about, showed his grandmother awake at 2 in the morning with what she described only as an urgent knowing that Marcus was in danger of a kind that required everything she had, and she'd written 4 pages of prayer before the peace came at nearly dawn. The dates aligned with the precision of something that couldn't be explained by coincidence. Every critical moment of his adult life, every valley he'd walked through, every night when the darkness had been most complete, Eleanor had been on her knees before God fighting for him. He sat in her rocking chair and read through the night while the January wind pushed against the cottage windows and the ocean moved against the island shore in its endless rhythm, and somewhere in the early morning hours of the second day he began to weep. Not the controlled, suppressed grief he'd occasionally allowed himself, but something much older and deeper, a release that seemed to come from a part of himself he'd sealed away years earlier and forgotten was still there. He wept for the friends he'd lost in Cuna and in the IED blast, for the marriages and futures those men would never have. He wept for Rachel and the marriage he'd allowed to die through his own damage and distance. He wept for his grandmother and the magnitude of her love that he was only now beginning to fully understand. And he wept for himself, for the boy who'd spent happy summers on this island and the man that boy had become, sitting in the dark with his grandmother's prayers in his lap and the slow recognition that he had never once been as alone as he'd believed. The final entry in Eleanor's journal was dated 3 days before her death. She'd written it with clear awareness that she was near the end of her life, addressing God with the intimate directness of someone who'd been in daily conversation with him for decades. She wrote that she'd asked him to keep the journal safe for Marcus until he came to find it, that she didn't know when that would be but trusted it would be when he needed it most. She asked God to let Marcus understand through these pages that he'd never been alone, not for a single day of his life, and that the moments he'd felt most abandoned had often been the moments when God was most present, working in ways that weren't visible but were nonetheless real. She asked for his healing with the specific and confident faith that had characterized her prayers throughout the journal, naming the things she knew were broken in him and asking for restoration in each area. And she closed with a sentence that Marcus read 3 times before it fully landed in him: Lord, let him find you here on this island the way I always have, and let him understand that coming home is always possible no matter how far away he has gotten. When dawn broke over the ocean outside the cottage window, Marcus put on his coat and walked down to the rocky shore for the first time since arriving. The January air was sharp and clean and smelled of salt and cold, and the waves came in and receded with the patient regularity that had been constant since long before any human being had stood on this shore to observe it. He stood at the water's edge and did something he hadn't done sincerely in years. He talked to God. Not in formal religious language or with the self-consciousness of someone uncertain they were being heard, but in the direct, honest way his grandmother had modeled throughout his childhood, just 2 people talking about what was true and what hurt and what was needed. He talked about the man who'd died, about his own survivor's guilt and the unanswerable questions it generated. He talked about Rachel and the marriage and the drinking and the Virginia hotel room that he'd kept sealed away for years. He talked about his grandmother and what it meant to read 30 years of prayers written specifically for him and to understand that every one of those prayers had been answered with a faithfulness he'd been too broken and too far away to recognize. He didn't receive a dramatic response. There was no voice from the clouds or vision in the morning sky. What happened was quieter and more lasting than anything theatrical could have been. Standing at the edge of that ocean in the growing light of a January morning, Marcus felt the darkness that had been living inside him for years begin to slowly release its grip. It didn't disappear completely because he was too honest for that kind of resolution and too damaged for such a quick fix. But it moved, making room for something that had been waiting patiently outside the walls he'd built, something that felt like the first real breath after a long time underwater. He recognized it after a moment of wondering, as the same thing he'd felt on summer evenings on the cottage porch listening to his grandmother talk about God. Peace. Real and unearned and beyond his ability to manufacture or explain. Marcus stayed on the island for 3 months, through the rest of winter and into the tentative beginning of a Maine spring. He cleaned the cottage thoroughly, made repairs to the dock and the shutters and the small storage shed behind the cottage that had developed a lean over the years. He chopped wood and cleared brush and learned the rhythms of the island in winter, the way the light changed across the water through the day, the particular sound the wind made coming through the shore grass at night, the schedule of the birds who stayed through the cold months and the ones who returned in March with the first hints of warmth. He read his way through Eleanor's bookshelf, finding her worn Bibles full of marginal notes and underlinings that showed her decades of engagement with the same texts, her handwriting in the margins recording insights and questions and connections that she'd found over a lifetime of reading. He stopped drinking during those months on the island, partly because the ferry and the distance made access to alcohol genuinely inconvenient and partly because in the absence of the noise and stress of city life the craving lost some of its power. The nightmares continued but with less frequency, and he began to understand that healing was not going to be a single dramatic event but a long, daily process of showing up and being honest and allowing the slow work of restoration to proceed at its own pace. He kept his own journal during those months, writing every morning at the kitchen table while the light came in from the ocean, recording what he was thinking and feeling and remembering and learning. The act of putting language to his experiences, of translating internal chaos into organized sentences on a page, had an effect that surprised him with its power. The ferry captain who ran the daily service to the island had known Eleanor for decades and checked in on the cottage occasionally during winter months when it typically sat empty. He'd been quietly surprised to find Marcus there in January and had gradually become a companion of sorts, sharing coffee on the dock and telling stories about Eleanor that Marcus had never heard, about her reputation on the mainland as someone to go to when you'd run out of ordinary options, about the number of people in Harborview who credited her prayers with specific and concrete changes in their lives. Through these conversations Marcus came to understand that his experience of Eleanor as a praying grandmother had been one instance of something she'd practiced broadly and consistently throughout her life, that her intercession had extended outward from her family into her community and beyond with the same specificity and faith that had filled 30 years of her journal. In April Marcus took the ferry to Harborview and drove to a VA facility where he requested help with his PTSD and his dependency on alcohol. He'd engaged with VA services before without sustained commitment, but this time felt different in a way he found difficult to articulate to the intake counselor except to say that something had shifted and he was ready to do the work. His therapist was a veteran herself, a former Army combat medic who'd done 2 tours in Iraq before transitioning to mental health work, and she brought to their sessions a particular understanding of combat trauma that made the early conversations less difficult than Marcus had expected. He told her about Eleanor's journal and the island and the January morning at the water's edge, and she received all of it without skepticism or clinical reduction, saying that in her experience faith was one of the most powerful resources available to veterans working through trauma and that she'd seen it accomplish things that no other intervention had managed. Over the following 18 months Marcus did the sustained, unglamorous work of actual recovery. He attended therapy consistently, did the homework he was assigned, and participated in a veteran support group where he was initially quiet and gradually more willing to contribute his own experience. He worked through the events of his deployments with a clinical thoroughness that was painful and necessary, learning to process and integrate experiences he'd been storing untreated for years. He addressed his alcohol dependency with the same committed approach, attending AA meetings and working the steps with a sponsor who was also a veteran and who understood the particular textures of his struggle. He contacted Rachel eventually, not with any hope of reconciliation but with the simple need to take responsibility properly for what he'd put her through. He wrote a letter because he thought a phone call might feel like pressure and an in-person meeting like more than she'd signed up for. He took full responsibility for the ways his damage had damaged their marriage, named specific things he'd done and failed to do, and asked for her forgiveness without attaching any expectation to the request. Her response came 3 weeks later, a gracious and careful letter that offered the forgiveness he'd asked for and expressed genuine gladness at learning he was doing better. The exchange closed something that had been left open and raw, and he felt the healing of it in ways that surprised him. Marcus began speaking at veteran support group meetings about his experience, sharing the story of Eleanor's journal and the island and the long process of recovery that had followed with the honest vulnerability of someone who'd been through the worst of it and come out the other side. He was careful about the spiritual dimension, not wanting to present his path as the only path or to alienate veterans who didn't share his faith, but he found consistently that the story of his grandmother's prayers resonated with people across a wide range of backgrounds and beliefs. Veterans who described themselves as not religious would come up after meetings with tears in their eyes saying they'd had grandmothers who'd prayed for them too, and that hearing Marcus's story had made them wonder whether those prayers had accomplished something real in their lives during the years they'd taught themselves alone. He eventually wrote a book about the experience, a memoir that began with the worst of his combat deployments and moved through the collapse of his civilian life and the discovery of Eleanor's journal and the slow work of healing that had followed. He was honest about everything, including the Virginia hotel room, and he found that this honesty was the quality readers responded to most strongly. The book found a publisher who'd worked extensively with veteran authors and a readership that spread far beyond the veteran community, touching people from all walks of life who recognized in Marcus's story something universal about losing yourself and being found, about the love of people who pray for you through valleys you don't even know they know you're walking through, about the discovery that you were never as alone as you believed. The letters Marcus received from readers became their own archive of human experience, hundreds of people telling him about their own grandmother's prayers and their own darkest nights and their own unexpected encounters with grace in the places where they expected to find only emptiness. He answered as many as he could, understanding that the story he'd told had become something larger than his personal experience, a point of connection for people who needed to know that others had been in the darkness and had found their way back to light. He still spent time on the island every summer, maintaining the cottage and fishing off the rocky shore and sitting on the porch in the evenings in Eleanor's rocking chair, which he'd refinished during that first winter and which remained in its place by the fireplace as the most important piece of furniture he would ever own. He kept her prayer journal in a fireproof box in the bedroom, reading it on the anniversary of her death each year and occasionally during difficult stretches when he needed to remember where he'd come from and what had carried him through. The journal had become his most valuable possession, not because of what it was worth materially but because of what it represented, 30 years of daily faithfulness from a woman who'd understood something about love and prayer that Marcus was still learning. On summer evenings he walked down to the shore in the long northern light and stood at the water's edge having the same kind of conversations with God that had begun on that January morning after reading through the night. The conversations were easier now, less desperate and more natural, the way any relationship becomes easier with years of consistent practice. He still brought the hard things, still talked about the man who'd died and the parts of himself that remained imperfectly healed, still asked questions that didn't have neat answers. But he brought other things too, gratitude and wonder and the small dailiness of a life being rebuilt with care. He talked about Eleanor frequently, telling God what he wished he'd said to her directly, expressing the gratitude that had arrived too late for her to receive. He'd come to believe that she heard it anyway, though he held that belief with the open hands of faith rather than the closed fist of certainty. Marcus Thompson had survived 3 combat tours and an IED blast that killed his entire squad and the collapse of everything he'd built in civilian life, and he'd found his way back not through willpower or the resources of the most powerful military in the world, but through an old woman's handwritten prayers and a small island off the coast of Maine and the slow patient grace of a God who had been there the whole time, waiting with the same faithfulness that Eleanor had modeled in the 3 years of daily prayers she'd written out for a grandson she loved completely and prayed for without ceasing until the day she drew her last breath. So that is the powerful and profound story of Marcus Thompson, the Army Ranger who lost everything and found something greater on his grandmother's island. Eleanor's 30 years of faithful daily prayers followed her grandson through every combat zone and every dark night and every moment when he thought himself entirely alone, and when he finally found them, written out in her own hand across 3 decades of mornings before sunrise, they became the bridge that carried him home to himself, to faith, and to a life rebuilt on a foundation more solid than anything he'd had before. Which part of the country are you watching this video from? Drop your state or city in the comments below, And if this story touched your heart and reminded you that the people who love us most are often interceding for us in ways we will never fully know, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more incredible stories of faith, healing, redemption, and the extraordinary love that follows us through our darkest moments. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.